We could not be more grateful that you've decided to join us for this afternoon's conversation on identifying and supporting the human needs of children of color. And to lead that conversation, we have Sean Brown, Executive Director of Becoming a Man Boston, Veronica Crespin Palmer, co-founder and CEO of Rise Colorado, Dr. Elias Samuel, Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and Partnerships at NWEA, and Elaine Townsend-Uten, co-founder and co-executive director of Latinx Ed. Again, we could not be more grateful that you've decided to spend your evening with us as a part of the Hunt Institute's Night Owl webinar series, and very grateful again that you've decided to spend it watching a race and education webinar. For all of you following along at home, we want to make sure that you can continue to engage with us here in this conversation and online. So please make sure you use the hashtag race and education when you're tweeting and when you're sharing the conversation online. And we also have a great Q&A tool down at the bottom of your screens. We want to make sure that you're engaging our moderator, engaging our panelists, asking deep questions. We want to make sure that we're actually answering the things that you came here to learn about. So again, I'm Senegal Alfred Mabry, and we could not be more grateful that you've decided to join us for this Hunt Institute webinar. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our fearless leader, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, President and CEO of the Hunt Institute. Thank you all again, and looking forward to this amazing conversation on identifying and supporting the human needs of children of color.
Thank you, Senegal, and good evening to all of our attendees. Welcome to this week's episode of Race and Education. As Senegal said, my name is Javed Siddiqui. I have the good fortune of serving as a president and the CEO of the Hunt Institute. I want to first take a moment to thank you for joining us for our first evening edition of Race and Ed. We introduced the evening time slot to make it easier based on feedback from both policymakers and educators, and we also have families that are participating in these webinars. So we know how busy and hectic everyone's schedules continue to be, and we hope this evening hour is more accommodating. Our past conversations in race and education have focused on education policy topics like teacher recruitment, pedagogy, challenging racism in state and local education systems, and the effect of poverty on students of color. Today, we want to dive deeper into another large topic, the social and emotional impact of the global pandemic, and certainly the ongoing civil rights crisis, especially on children of color. Before the pandemic, researchers are estimating that more than 38% of children in every state have had at least one or more adverse childhood experience. Traumatic events take place when students experience violence, witness violence, or feel a violation of their dignity. Some researchers even believe that students can experience historical trauma, which comes after historical losses and assaults on their culture. Now, as COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting families of color and our students are witnessing violence against people of color, like the murder of George Floyd, many are expecting to see an increase in the number of trauma cases. That trauma will manifest itself as trouble forming relationships with instructors, with peers, difficulty controlling emotions, and hypervigilance, all of which ultimately affect students of color's academic health, their emotional health, their actual health. So many developmental impacts from this trauma, especially on our young people of color. So our panelists this evening are going to discuss that impact. So I want to thank our panelists for taking time away from their crazy schedules to share your expertise and your enthusiasm for creating supports to help students and families understand and manage and overcome their trauma. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our partner in crime from our affiliate, Duke Sanford School, Elaine, to offer some welcoming remarks and get our conversation going. Elaine.
I'm actually coming to you from UNC Chapel Hill. That was interesting, Duke, not Duke, but thank you so much for having me here with you today. I was just a little nod. We actually have a big rivalry over here. So thank you so much for having me. I also want to start off before I dive into sharing a little bit about my story and my work, is I would like to actually take a moment to honor the land beneath me as I join you from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The land that UNC sits on is land that was originally stewarded by 4 indigenous tribes, the Occaneechi and Socorro, the Eno, and also the Saxapa people. We honor these tribes today by recognizing that this institution of higher education is built on land stolen from those who were here before the colonizers arrived. Additionally, this land has borne witness to over 400 years of the enslavement, torture, and systematic mistreatment of African people and their descendants. So we honor these people today by recognizing them in order to break the cycle of colonization and the continued erasure of Indigenous and Black people. We must acknowledge this history of the spaces and the places that we occupy to both understand and unlearn the many ways that we have been socialized. So thank you for taking a moment with me to recognize this history. My name is Elaine Townsend-Uten. I am the co-founder, co-executive director of Latinx Ed. Latinx Ed is a community that amplifies the lived experiences of Latinx immigrant families to break down educational barriers in North Carolina. Our work is deeply personal as we carry the identities of the students we serve. So we are Latinx immigrants or children of immigrants who are raised in the rural South. We are first generation college students, and many of us are coming from low income backgrounds. Today, we are here to make direct connections between race and the field of education. So when we consider the Latinx community, we must also recognize the ways that this ethnicity has been racialized. And we must recognize that we have brown and Black brothers and sisters, hermanos y hermanas, that are experiencing the ramifications of systemic racism in schools. We see this in the educational disparities in North Carolina in particular, in the work that we do. In many ways, we are at the intersection of race, education, immigration, and identity. And we are dedicated more than ever to breaking down the educational barriers that are upheld by the imperialistic, white supremacist, capitalistic patriarchy that surrounds us. So at Latinx Ed, we do this by centering positive racial ethnic identity development, increasing college access, and connecting practice to policy through civic engagement. And today I am fully sinking into my North Carolinian and Peruvian roots and my 1.75 generation immigrant status as we get into today's webinar as these incredible panelists unpack what identifying and supporting the human needs of children of color can look like. So to all the panelists here, what you have to say is super essential, it's valuable, it's life-saving, and I'm so eager to lean into this real talk with you all and to learn from you. And to our audience, thank you for showing up. We encourage you to drop comments and questions in the chat. Let us know what is resonating with you. We want to hear your voices. So that being said, let's get started. And we'll start off with an opening question for each panelist, and we'll start from there. So this year has been full of emotional challenges for students of color across the country, including the loss of life from the global pandemic, students unexpectedly being separated from their classmates and support centers due to schools closing, and our continued civil rights crisis. So please introduce yourself and tell us how you think these challenges might affect students' academic, professional, social, emotional, or other health outcomes for years to come. And let's start with Veronica.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for gathering us all on this evening for this very important conversation. My name is Veronica Crespin Palmer, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Rise Colorado. So we do family engagement and community organizing with Black, Latinx, immigrant, refugee, and undocumented families, all in the name of building the family-led movement for educational equity. We are in Aurora, which is the most diverse school district and city in the state of Colorado. We have families from over 130 countries, speaking over 160 different languages. We're one of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country. So with that, we have families from all over the world, speaking beautiful, different languages, different cultures, different religions, and we believe diversity is our strength. So, and we also believe that the future of successful social justice movements and community organizing will be multiracial, multilingual, multicultural, because when we come together as communities of color with our white allies, that's when we're truly unstoppable. So again, we work with Black, Latinx, immigrant, refugee, and undocumented families to educate, engage, and empower them to rise as change agents for educational equity. So we're seeing right now is a lot, because we are working with the most disenfranchised and marginalized students in Aurora and in Colorado. Our families have lost their jobs. They're facing eviction. Our families are facing food insecurities. Our families are facing lack of internet access, so their kids can't participate online. We've heard from families that domestic violence is on the rise, especially within the Latinx community. And our families cannot afford mental health and wellness support. Why? Because many of them are undocumented. And so any public charge, they do not want to touch because they're afraid that they'll further penalize them from ever being able to become citizens and be on a path to citizenship. Our Black and refugee families also can't afford it. And there's also stigmas out there that therapy is for white folks, the people who can afford it. It's very important that we demystify that all of us deserve mental health and wellness support, but we also deserve to have it accessible. Families can't afford $125 an hour for a therapist. So we at RISE are providing racially specific and culturally responsive therapists so that our families and students can sit with a therapist who looks like them, who has a shared background, to talk about their experiences. Because the amount of trauma, violence, exhaustion, and overall, despair is high. So in order for families to support their children, we need to address these things. So we're seeing a lot, and how Elaine said, the generational trauma is there, and also it's only being further expounded upon. These inequities always existed. They're not new because of COVID, but they're being further exacerbated to levels I in my life have never seen. And as the mother of two beautiful Afro-Latino children who are in 6th grade and 3rd grade, I'm very worried about the future. But I'm also an optimist that our people are resilient. Our communities have survived slavery, have survived coming across the border, have survived being in detention centers and ripped apart from our children and families. And we could survive this as well, but it's going to take all of us to really drill down, to talk about the inequities that exist and face them head on. So again, thank you to the Hunt Institute for having us for this very important conversation.
Veronica, already starting us off with the real talk. I'm here for it. Thank you so much. And Dr. Samuel, will you go next?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to my home this evening. I come to you first and foremost as a parent and a wife, and I think it's important to level set in that conversation because I am a parent of 2 Black sons in elementary school, and I am also the wife of a Black husband, and not just a Black husband, but a big Black husband from the rural South. And I point out his size because there is certainly a stigma around men of color, and particularly large men of color. So a lot of the challenges, the fears that 20 years ago when I was young and in college, and never thought I would have, I am now having head on as a parent. I'm also a former educator. I was an elementary teacher, principal, assistant principal, and I'm a staunch public education advocate. I am also a policy influencer. I've spent the last decade of my professional career working with policymakers at the gubernatorial, federal, local level on various topics on education. And at the core of my work, education equity is really it. And it is because I know, as a first-generation American and a woman who very much identifies as a Black woman but is Latina, understanding the challenges that come with being a bilingual first-generation American. And so I try to bring that authentic self to work every day in what I do. And so that's a little bit what brings me to the work. I am currently the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and Partnerships at NWEA, and I'm also a fellow to the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. In answering this question, one of the things I firmly believe, there was a quote I heard years ago that really has stuck with me over the years, that we're going to use data to have a conversation because data can really ground us. Because if we're just going to talk about opinions, we'll use mine. So I'm going to just call out some numbers to bring this home. So this first question is really talking about the impacts of what we're going to potentially see. I want to first start with the economic impact, because we know that when we talk about race disparities, so much of it is rooted in wealth and power. When we talk about this COVID impact, right now, we know that 1 in 5 Black families can work from home, 1 in 6 Hispanic families can work from home. And when you translate that into percentages, 37% of Asian families can work from home, 29.9% of white families can work from home, 19.7% of Black families can work from home, and 16.2% of Hispanic families can work from home, which means the majority of frontline workers are people of color and who also do not have the opportunity to work from home. So they are more likely to become ill from the sickness, not have access to PTO days, vacation days, to be able to adjust, to be able to be at home to support their kids while they're learning. So there is already going to be a massive economic impact to families who are already teetering on the economic wealth or poverty line. So I think that's something that we need to underscore, because wealth and power are so interconnected. I think we also need to understand the health and social emotional impacts. And I really want to talk about those together, because one of the things that the science has told us and continues to tell us is that the impact of race and racism on the body and brain are real. It has genetic impacts, it has physiological impacts, it has emotional impacts. And what we're seeing right now, what our families are experiencing right now, is absolutely activating stress genes. We are going to see an entire generation with higher blood pressure, higher instances of inflammation and all of the diseases that come with that, because of stress, and the stress that's being created not just by COVID, but all of the other racial tensions that are happening in our society. And so we have to understand that health and physical well-being and emotional health all will play out eventually on how the body responds. Then on an academic standpoint, what we're seeing is that the bias that was occurring in the brick and mortar structure of school has now extended itself into the virtual world, and we're seeing it play out. I want to just call out a couple of stories that have hit the news lately. We had Isaiah Elliott, a 12-year-old boy in Colorado who had a toy gun, and the police were called and sent to his home because he had a toy gun in the background. We had a 15-year-old Black girl, Grace, from Michigan, who was arrested for a probation violation, which I'll be clear, she did have for fighting and for stealing. She had a probation order, but the reason she didn't violate the probation orders, she didn't complete her online assignment. And that is what the judge used to then put her in juvenile detention. Then there's the Garcia girls out of California who were sitting outside of a Taco Bell with their computers to try to gain access while their mom was working to Wi-Fi so that they could be online virtually. What we know is that equal access is not equitable. Right now, we have 15 million students, which is about 30% of our student population, that do not have broadband and or a device. Then we have another 9 million kids that don't have access to either. And most of those children are children of color. So it's really time as a society that we take a step back and really ask ourselves, why is the data telling us this story? And we can't afford to neglect students of color, because as of 2 years ago, the majority in public school are children of color. And so this majority will soon be our workforce. So if we don't address these equity gaps, we will not have a prepared and diverse workforce.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel. This data is so important, and thank you for bringing that to the space. And Sean, will you round us off?
Yes, thank you. As soon as I get myself off of mute. First, Dr. Samuel and Veronica and Elaine, thank you for setting a safe container for tonight's conversation. And I just want to start by saying that I'm the father of a 15-year-old daughter, Sinai, and the husband of 20 years to my amazing wife, Shanda. And during these times, the lack of respect for women is really prevalent in our society and has been exacerbated by the murder of Breonna Taylor. The disregard for the Queen's life is unfathomable. And I just want to say to all our kings out there joining us tonight, I say the need for respect for womanhood is needed more now than ever. And it gives me an immense amount of joy to join you queens tonight on this panel. And to you queens, I just want to say I see you, I hear you, and I stand with you. And I really look forward to engaging in tonight's dialogue with you also. I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to speak that truth, speak my truth. And I plan on doing that all night. So thank you for setting that safe container and having me feel safe and starting that way. So thank you. Sean Brown, Executive Director of BAM Boston. I lead a team of 15 dedicated men of color here in Boston. And let me first say that academic, professional, and social emotional growth are all linked. And they shouldn't be addressed in silos. But I believe that's a discussion for another panel and another day. But let me also say that communities of color have been facing educational and occupational inequities long before COVID and this most recent civil rights crisis. So Elaine, to answer your question though, the challenges spurred by the pandemic and the civil rights crisis will have a major impact on the growth of our young people. And that's if we don't intervene and we don't intervene collectively. And I'm going to talk about that a lot tonight, is we. And in Boston, the city I'm a product of, before the pandemic, on-time graduation rates for Black and Latino students were already trending downwards, while rates for white students were going up. Before the pandemic, graduation rates for Black and Latino students were 10 and 15 percentage points lower, respectively, than their white peers. And again, this was before the pandemic. So now, throw in the global pandemic, which has completely disrupted education as we know it, and is keeping our young kings and queens from important academic and social supports needed so that they can just graduate within 4 years. I believe it's going to be a problem. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought, but for me, it's going to be a problem. And here's the thing. My fear is that the graduating class of 20, 21, 22, 23, and beyond will be missing a lot of Black and brown faces, just calling it for what it is. And everyone on this panel well understands the employment and earning challenges that await these scholars, young kings and queens, if they don't at least get a high school diploma. We know what that story is. Regarding their social emotional growth, I would say I'm older. I won't say I won't get into my age, but I'm older, and I remember some of the hallmarks of being young, many of which I can't share with this audience tonight, but most of what I remember though involved some sort of engagement with others, or social interactions, whether those interactions were hanging out with my friends playing basketball in college, learning from my colleagues at my first internship at Liberty Mutual, or frankly, being truthful, getting in trouble, that I learned important life skills and developed emotionally. For the foreseeable future, social interaction will be through a screen, though I have kids and could argue that this was the way well before COVID. How do we make sure that young people, especially our Black and brown youth, continue to have those opportunities to learn, grow organically? It won't be easy, and I'll say that again, it won't be easy. But if I don't have, not if I don't, but if we don't have all the answers, what I will say. We don't have the answers, but I know that, again, we collectively need to work together to ensure the engagement, with them, even if it's through a screen, remains. We need to be sure that it remains safe, authentic, and nurturing for our young kings and queens. That's what my team at BAM and the program is working with all of our partners to do. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Sean. You, to your point, we know that the inequities and the adverse the experiences children of color are having during this time are not new. but that the COVID-19 pandemic and civil unrest is only increasing the stress for our young people. So thank you for sharing those tangible examples. Is there any other effect of the adverse experiences for children of color that you would like to highlight? Or are there any also ways that you can also talk about how they're compounding over time on health and academic performance?
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't know if you were talking.
You're good. No, I just wanted to keep going. You're on a roll.
Okay, no, amazing, amazing. I didn't know if you were talking to the group. You know, what is the effects of adverse experiences? I believe is your question.
Yeah.
For our scholars. Let me.
And in some of the examples that you shared too of the graduation rates in particular, like that.
Yeah, that's great. So exactly. So thank you. So you know, I've heard a few things. You know, I've heard a few things from our scholar that really resonates with me and what we do at BAM. And it is that, you know, trauma and education don't mix. So many of our young kings, we have struggled through trauma because of what they look like and where they're from. Let's put aside the pandemic for a moment. Many of our young people who come through BAM deal with trauma daily, but by, as you talked about, poverty and violence in the communities in which they live in, from systemic racism, from a lack of opportunity, and just shifting back to the pandemic. Let me answer your question by first sharing a story of one of our scholars. His name is Armani. This will be Armani's 4th year in the BAM program. We spend a lot of time simply listening to our scholars and elevating their voices and experiences, just as I'm doing now. And a few weeks into the pandemic, Armani expressed that he was feeling stressed and overwhelmed. His parents had just been laid off their jobs. There was no money coming into the house. Armani said one of the things that plays over and over in his head, he said that every morning he wakes up and has to decide whether to sign in to his online class or to support his family. Like that is awful. You know, it's an awful choice to have, to make, especially as a 17-year-old. But you know, the pandemic forces the young king to make that choice every morning. You know, education or family. You know, unfortunately, our Armani story isn't a unique one, particularly in the communities of color. Trauma affects every second and every day for everyone going through it. You know, from my own experiences, it's not just something at least most people can turn off. As a result, I would say it impacts that our scholars, it impacts everything that our scholars do. We have scholars who have lost family members to the pandemic and to gun violence. Our scholars confide their experiences to us. Our counselors help them process these experiences. So we're not surprised if he's not done well or on a test or skipped a class online. We know that the context, you know, that there's context surrounding those decisions.
Thank you so much, Sean. That is, I think those.
And I'll just close yeah, with this. I'm sorry. You know, almost what I would say to close that thought. Not many others know that though, and those young men will get called for not doing well on that test. You know, academics almost always is going to come second to trauma. And again, I'm just going to go back to the we, and I'm going to keep emphasizing we because no one organization has all the answers. I believe no one person has all the answers. We have to support the mental health of our young people because we know that when you're able to address trauma constructively and be in a good place mentally, then you're far better positioned to succeed. And I would just say that just in life and academically.
I think that is a great transition to this next question that I have for Dr. Samuel. And in the chat already, the data that you shared, people are resonating with that power that is embedded in that. So when it comes to assessments and policy around assessments, needing to adapt to understand the emotional challenges students are facing during this year of crisis. What are your thoughts on that and how they need to evolve?
Yeah, so before I get into assessment specific policy recommendations, I just want to take a step back and address policy particularly because there's questions happening in the Q&A and I just need to take a minute and respond. I want to be clear that this is not a Black thing. This is not a Hispanic thing. This is a people of color and also a poverty thing. But it's not exclusive to poverty because there are people in rural communities that are also impacted. But we have to specifically call out people of color because what's happening now is by design. It is institutional, it is systematic, it is planned, and there are concrete policies in place. I mean, written policies that are on the books that create financing structures, that create housing structures, that perpetuate these disparities. It's not just coincidence. And for some folks who wouldn't want to believe that, there's actually, I'm going to try to find the second video because I can't recall the name of it, but there's one, for example, one documentary that you can watch called Cracking the Code, and it talks about the systems and policies of injustice that create some of these racial disparities. And I know for myself, the first time I saw it, it slapped the rose-colored glasses that I saw the world off my face. The whole notion of, oh, you can just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or you know what, Aaliyah, because you made it, why don't other immigrants make it? Well, their situations and circumstances are different. And so I would just encourage you, the collective you, not an individual you, to really take the time to look at the policies and systems and structures, which is what we're trying to challenge and change now, so that we can really truly have equitable access and opportunity. So sorry, the chat in the Q&A box was just, it was going. And also, if I can, I'll find a way. I have a Word document that outlines specifically education policy from the 1700s to as recent as 1997 that perpetuated inequity in education. So if you don't think it's real, I can actually give you a laundry list of education policies that either had to be pulled back or still on the books and being challenged so that you could see it for yourself. So I can follow up later. So then, sorry, Elaine, back to the question that you asked me around particularly assessment policy. I think the first thing that we really need to do is think about equity and accessibility. Right now, I mean, we know that assessments have bias in them. They were also built and designed that way from when the first assessments were created in the early 1900s and all of the iterations that have been used since. And for those, again, who may question whether or not that's true, I challenge you to look up the Charlottesville Letter of the 1950s. A woman right here in Charlottesville, Virginia, outlined how assessments and cutoff scores of the scholastic test that was being used could be what the district used to ensure that desegregation didn't happen. And they used assessments in order to be able to do so. And so we have to really address the purpose of assessments and also the bias in assessment. And I can say that because I work for an assessment company and I have great pride in working where I do because I can say our CEO has really challenged all of us to think about the role that assessment plays in equity and equitable outcomes for kids and what we can do around innovation. Moving into innovation, we have to think about innovative assessments. We cannot continue to treat education as we did in the 1950s. It is not the Industrial Revolution. We are not all prepared for factories. It is a different workforce. It is a different employment field where technology has changed the game. And so our assessments should also evolve as education has as well. I also think it's important to think about what these learning trajectories are and think about longer term growth for school improvement goals. We know that growth does not happen overnight, and it oftentimes doesn't happen in one school year. And yet so many schools are being graded and reviewed, if I could use that term, based off of just one academic year's growth. And what we're seeing now more than ever with COVID is we have to have an intentional conversation around growth and proficiency. It no longer can be one or the other, but they both need to have an equal seat at the table. I also think it's important at the federal level that we really start talking about modernizing the entire accountability system. And not only do we need to modernize the accountability system, but it's time to really disentangle the accountability system from the assessments. Because as a former teacher, as a former principal, the summative information that I got back didn't help drive instruction. And now that we have this COVID class where kids are going to be all over the place with all these different instructional areas, we need real-time assessments that can give teachers real-time instructional levels so that assessments can drive instruction, not assess instruction. It really has two very different purposes. And I think the last thing that we need to think about is really what this COVID class and period is doing for the summative assessment. We can't just say, oh, well, we're not gonna, we don't think we should do summatives and waivers for everybody. Nobody else has to test, because then we're not getting data on kids. And I think about my own boys. They're well-intended parents. We have worked with them every day. We read, we do math, but my kids are still like blocks of Swiss cheese, where the overall concept is there because we've kept the routine and the structures as much as we could, but there's still gaps in concepts because either we didn't know to teach it as parents or we didn't reinforce it as parents. And whether it's a small hole or a large hole, we don't know. And the only way to do that is for the teacher to have meaningful assessments, to identify those gaps in knowledge and be able to plug and play so we can get kids back on grade level and address the unfinished learning.
That was juicy. That was a lot of really important information. Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel, and even bringing in your role as a parent too. That is another transition to Veronica, as we know that a child's first support network and advocate is their parents. So what role should family and community voice play in helping students process their experiences?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple ways to think about that. Families definitely have a role in helping their child process, but so does the education system. There is role and responsibility there. It can't be, families, we need you to do this thing. It has to be a holistic support of, the system providing the right amount of counselors and therapists and social workers so that this doesn't all land on families. Because families right now, for those who are still with children at home doing online learning, they are the teacher, the therapist, the social worker, everything. And that's a lot to ask. So as Sean was saying, it has to be all of us, a collective we, and what are we all doing? And what role are we all playing to address this? So I'll paint a little picture of what our family leaders have shared they're going through. So they're sharing that it's really hard to focus on education when you don't know where your next meal will come from, and you don't know if you're going to have a roof over your head at the end of the month, because your landlord is demanding rent, you don't have a job, and it's hard to get a new job. And as the president announced today, there will be no new stimulus package, according to him, till after the election. So what are families supposed to do? That means unemployment benefits, the federal stimulus package are not there for families to access, which only further exacerbates the economic crisis that families are going through. How are families going to pay their rent? How are families going to put food on the table? How are they going to pay their Wi-Fi bill so that their child can sit comfortably in front of the computer for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a day to get that online instruction? And the children are absorbing that, that stress and trauma and depression from their families. So it's just this horrible cyclical cycle that we're going through. But also that, the stimulus package, again, want to share that our undocumented families cannot access that. They do not qualify for stimulus or unemployment. So that leads families into a really horrific choice of, if they could pick up a couple hours and a job here and there, that means they have to choose, sometimes leaving their children home alone, to go work. And that's a horrific choice that families are having to make. They rather stay home and be home with their children and protect them and care for them, but they have to pick up hours when they can. They have to go to work when they can. So forcing families as a society to make impossible choices. So children are being left home alone to care for themselves, not because their families don't love them, because their families do love them and want to put food on the table and a roof over their head and protect them as much as they can. And also, as we've been sharing some data, students of color, I saw an article that students of color are dropping out at alarming rates from high school and college. Why? Because they have to go to work. Because many of their families can't get jobs or have been sick with COVID, so they have to go work and provide for their family. So what is going to happen to this generation? Like Sean shared and Dr. Samuel, we're going to see our graduation rates plummet. We're going to see a lot less Black, Brown, Indigenous faces because our children are having to go to work and drop out of school to put food on the table and help pay for rent. And that's not fair. That's not how it should be, that burden is placed upon them. But also back to the system, I really think about what is the responsibility of, predominantly in the United States, we have white educators. In rural public schools in Colorado, it's predominantly white educators. So what is the role and responsibility to look at the bias and our biases as educators? I'm a former teacher as well. I taught kindergarten and third grade in Los Angeles. So I think about how I needed to think about my own biases as I was a teacher, but also how is our whole education system, and especially our white teachers, really think about their biases and what they bring into the classroom, and how are they really interrogating those biases so that whether they're doing online learning or in-person learning, because some of our schools are going back in person the next coming weeks, how are they making sure that children are having the safe, welcoming environment that they deserve? Because our families and children have been through a lot. They have seen a lot, and they deserve to be heard, to be validated and seen as their whole selves. And we really need our educators to make a shift in their mindsets that low-income families, families of color do care, do value, and do want an excellent education for their child. They're putting in the work. So how can we make sure our educators are really supporting our families of color and really interrogating their biases so that our children can thrive, not just survive, but thrive through this pandemic and receive the excellent education they deserve? So that's something we're thinking about a lot, and how the system is really in a place. And there's a reckoning. There is a reckoning right now in the education system, and families and students are ready to reclaim and reimagine the education system, and how are educators providing the safe space and opportunity to do so. So families, students, and educators are co-creating what's possible and reimagining things together. Because if we recreate the education system without families and students again, we're going to be having the same conversation the next 10 or 20 years, and we simply cannot afford that.
Veronica, coming through again. My mind is going so many directions. I'm going to kind of tie in a few of these comments together, because in the chat too, there have been questions about systems of accountability as we talk about the necessary shift of mindsets, of having these critical conversations in schools, outside of schools, and how these systems that were never meant to serve us truly, right, are impacting our youth and our children. And so as we think about this piece of accountability, and this could go to anyone who would like to start, but how do we bring others to the table to have these conversations about trauma and address these issues, knowing that there is a level of fragility that sometimes turns people away from them?
I think I just recently released a podcast, and the last episode of my podcast was a group of high school activists and student leaders. And one of them, they were just a phenomenal group of young adult men and women. And to a degree, I feel like we as adults should just get out of the way and let them lead. I have a lot more faith in the next generation than sometimes I do our own. But, one of the things they consistently mentioned was to simply create the space for the conversation, create an authentic space for the conversation. And they even mentioned that at the elementary level, which is so true. My 6-year-old has all kinds of opinions about virtual school and what the pros and cons of it are. He has all kinds of opinions about the assessments he just had to take, all kinds of opinions. But what they said is, they're asked for their opinion, but it doesn't go anywhere, or it's invalidated because, oh, you're just a high schooler, or you're just. So if we're going to ask for the opinion, we have to honor it, validate it, and do something with it. And it all starts with creating the space for the authentic conversation.
Yeah, I really agree with what Dr. Samuel shared. In addition to that, I saw in the Q&A about how do you help people build empathy? Because empathy is a really big piece of understanding what other people are living through. So that's something we're really thinking about in our work. So actually last week, we just released this report called Our Stories, Our Time, where we are amplifying the voices of Black, Latinx, immigrant, refugee, and undocumented families and literally what they're living through during this time. How about 29% of our family leaders have contracted COVID. About 29%. That is horrifying because, as Dr. Samuel said, they're frontline workers. They're in the hospitality industry. They're in construction. They're in custodial services. So they're on the front lines. And about 29% of our family leaders have contracted COVID. And that has been devastating for their families because, again, they don't have paid time off. They don't have access to health care either. They can't afford it. So all that to say, it's just really important during this time that we take time to learn what others are experiencing. We're all in this together, but we're all having very different experiences based on our privilege and our homes and our financial and educational, opportunities and privileges that we have. So it's really important to us that usually during crises, the voices of those most impacted and disenfranchised are forgotten or ignored because we all have our own situations, but that cannot happen. Until we really elevate and center those voices, we're all going to feel like our own issues are the biggest without thinking about all of us as one, as human beings and as humankind, to understand that no, people of color are experiencing this pandemic at much higher exacerbated stressful rates, and that the racial trauma, the killings of the Black community are traumatizing the Black community at much higher rates. And that affects all of us. All of us are in this together. So it's really important that we really stop to learn each other's stories and what each other are experiencing, because what the 5 of us are experiencing on this phone is very different from what the Q&A and the group listening is experiencing. So how do we really understand what's going on in each other's lives? But after we learn and we empathize, we do something about it. Because it's one thing to read, to watch this live on Facebook, to listen to a podcast, to read this report, and then do nothing. We all have to do something and step up. Because if we're quiet and complicit, then we're part of the problem.
Veronica, can I just add on? I think the trauma it's multiple layers. As a woman of color, with a husband and children of color, there's a trauma of what I see on the news, to the point where I've turned off my notifications and I get myself mentally ready to then tune in, take the dosages that I need, and then I tune back out. So that's one level of the realities of this trauma. But there's also the anxiety and the pre-trauma of when things open back up, of when I have to send my boys back to school, who my 6-year-old is the size of an 8-year-old, my 9-year-old's the size of a 12-year-old. And I know they're not just Black boys in a predominantly white school that I have to worry about harsher discipline rates. I have to worry about, will they be treated differently? But now I have to worry about, they've been home where they've been nurtured, loved, supported, to now going back where that safety net isn't going to be there. And so there's that worry to also worry about for families of color. So it's the current reality, but it is the uncertainty of what's coming down the line also that creates a sense of trauma that we have to recognize.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Samuel. My daughter was bullied in school last year, and now I just, raising a young Black boy and a young Black woman, it's just like, she's safer here at home. Like literally, I could say that she is safer here at home, but she's a social butterfly. She wants to be at school, making friends and hanging out on the playground. But honestly, I'm terrified for when she goes back, because I know she's safer here. She's actually healed while being here at home. She tells me, Mom, I feel better. I feel safe. I feel like I could be myself. And what's going to happen when she goes back, I'm not sure. But as a young Afro-Latina, she's experienced incredible racism and bullying, and she's been able to heal these last, 6 months. But what happens when she goes back, I'm not sure.
And I just want to add to what both the queens said. Something that I feel we must address, not only in our young people, but the trauma in adults as well. We talked about accountability. We all, this reminds me of the work that we do. We all have heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. And there's a lot of hurt adults charged with dealing with our young people and healing our young people. So there's accountability on our piece to do our work. And at BAM, we talk about that being a ruthless self-examination and owning your trauma and your baggage and knowing how that shows up in your life every day. How's it affecting you at work? How's it affecting you at home? So, that piece is important. And there's an accountability piece for us adults to address that and deal with that. So wanted to just add that piece to everything else that you all have added, but it's definitely about creating that safe space. We've learned in this work that it's not only our scholars who need the safe space, it's the adults, it's teachers, it's the stakeholders who also look for this safe space to address and talk about some of these issues that they're not able to address at the workplace and things of that nature. So definitely the safe space and accountability and just really, doing a ruthless self-examination as individuals.
Thank you so much for adding that, Sean. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Veronica.
I was just going to say, I totally agree with that. And that, the saying is hurt people hurt people. And I think we're seeing that in incredible amounts right now. How are adults hurting each other? How are hurt children hurting children? So I agree. How do we all do that self-examination of how hurt people, but actually take time to heal and take care of ourselves and each other?
That critical reflection is essential. And this actually, I'm even noticing the time is flying, but as we kind of come to a close today, I feel like this question is connected to that call to action and what we want to communicate with the people here listening to this webinar and what they can do next. So what is a step that educators, administrators, researchers, or policymakers that are listening right now, what can they do right after this event ends to help the children and the students in their community feel like there are leaders that are seeking to understand and help them also process their trauma?
Is that to anyone or?
It is to anyone, but Sean,
Okay.
if you want to start us off, you're welcome to go for it.
Awesome. If there's a call to action or a couple of steps we can take, I would say one, ensure, and Dr. Samuel talked about this earlier, is ensure that young people are at the table. Young people should not just be the beneficiaries of our program. They should be with us at the table to inform, adapt them, and evaluate them. We say all the time, they are the true experts of their own experiences. So they definitely should be at the table with us. And then the second is, and this goes back to what we were just talking about, is creating safe spaces for young people to express their feelings. And when they're doing so, affirm and validate them. For our young people to thrive in post-COVID world, they need more safe spaces and mental health services to make sure that they're able to adapt and navigate the very uncertain times ahead of us. And we all have a role to play in that.
Initially, I had a response for educators and administrators, but I'm actually going to speak to the policymakers. In my previous role, I worked at the National Governors Association and had a chance to work closely with governors' offices. And right now, governors have such power, policy power. And what I would like to say to those policymakers is, let's not try to get back to normal. Stop saying, let's get back to normal. Normal was not working for large groups of people across this nation. Urban, rural, suburban, Black, poor, white, Hispanic. We had so many subgroups that the normal wasn't working for. So as you're crafting policy, as you're looking across your systems from health to criminal justice to education and thinking about how you can use your federal stimulus dollars, how you can use your education dollars, how you can use your health, your human service dollars, really start thinking towards the future and what we want for the future, rather than trying to just get back to what we had, because it just wasn't working. And as policies swing from one side to another, and we see the pendulum just swinging from left to right, it's an opportunity to stop, really take inventory of what we're doing and why, and start to think about things differently, and also bring new voices to the table. Because if, there's another quote, don't do something for us without us. If the decision makers in the room don't reflect those who you are making decisions for, then you should stop and rethink that decision. And so that would really be my advice to the policy makers, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or the federal level.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Sean and Dr. Samuel. And I absolutely agree. And how do educators and policymakers and district officials, teachers, really think about how can we stop doing things to and start doing things with? Because doing things to communities have gotten us into this exact mess that we're in right now. And I agree with Dr. Samuel, we can't go back to normal, but also whose normal was that? If white supremacy and racism is normal, no thank you. Do not want to go back to that. Again, there's a real reckoning in terms of the education system, in terms of criminal justice, in terms of the civil rights infringements that are happening. That is not normal. We cannot normalize that. It is time to do something different. And we at RISE, our theory of change is that those most impacted by the inequity that exists must lead the movement for change themselves. So we asked ourselves, who's most impacted by educational inequity? It's low-income families and families of color. Therefore, they have to lead with us alongside and behind them as allies. Just as Dr. King and African Americans led the civil rights movement, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez led the farm workers movement, and women led the suffrage movement, those most impacted must lead. So we all need to be asking ourselves, how are those most impacted leading? Are they? In my opinion, they're not. And the injustices that we're facing in education, criminal justice reform, housing, workforce, those most impacted are not leading. There's people who think they know better, so they're doing to and not with. And so something I really recommend is to see, building on what Dr. Samuel said, to see families and students as architects and not just objects of policy. Our families and students are most proximate. They're closest to the issues and challenges they are facing. Therefore, they have the best solutions and ideas to our most pressing challenges in education and beyond. At RISE, our family leaders have had over 60 policy wins, actions, and organizing wins because they have the best ideas, and it's our job to help them implement those policy ideas because they know what they're facing and they know what the solutions are. But how are we as education system beyond trusting families? Do we truly trust families and students to create the policy changes needed? No, we don't. So how can we have an entire mindset shift there to trust those most impacted, to lead, to create the policy changes, and the rest of us follow them and support them to make those critical changes. So a quick tool, Senegal made the student-facing version with Aspen Institute, and RISE, we made the family leader-facing version of how families can work together with policymakers to create policy and co-create together. And then Senegal made the student-facing version. So Senegal, if you could share those in the chat, those are really awesome tools where families can start creating their own policies along with students and get policymakers on board. Because honestly, we can't wait. Nobody's coming to save us. We must save ourselves, and we can.
Awesome. Thank you. Elaine, there was a question in the chat, if I just may, around, what is BAM? I did say just BAM, assuming that, everyone knows, but Youth Guidance is Becoming a Man program is an evidence-based, school-based counseling program for young men of color in grades 7 through 12. We use a clinical theory approach rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy, along with rites of passage work. And we engage our young men in a curriculum that focuses on 6 core values: integrity, accountability, self-determination, positive anger expression, respect for womanhood, and visionary goal settings. Our goal is to guide our young men to learn and internalize and practice social cognitive skills and make responsible decisions for their future and become better members in school and in their community. So wanted to get that out there.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
And I see some people have been also dropping some links to some important videos and websites, and also Senegal's been dropping some really important links too that have been mentioned in this conversation. So if you're looking for them, definitely check them out. And as I look at time, this is already, we have to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists for your wisdom, for the depth of critical thought that you brought to this conversation. We're so grateful to you for your time and your expertise. And also thank you to our audience for engagement. Thank you for your questions and just leaning into the calls to actions that our panelists shared for how you can nurture the emotional needs of our youth. And this is your call to action now, to do something, to take what you have learned from this conversation and turn it into action. So thinking critically about whose needs and voices you are centering as you design and create spaces, policy, experiences for our students of color in particular. And also thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this webinar and these crucial conversations. And so I'll turn it over to you, Senegal.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for such an amazing moderating of an important and deep webinar conversation. We also could not be more grateful for you, our audience, who decided to join us for this nighttime webinar. Thank you again. We have another Race and Education webinar coming in the series on October 22nd, which will be all student panel. It'll be an all student panel. So we want to make sure that the Hunt Institute and policymakers and educators have access to great student voices who can help lead policy conversations, because they are the leaders of our movement and they will be our future or current policymakers. And then soon coming to that, this Thursday, we are having an early efforts ensuring developmentally appropriate practice amidst a global pandemic, which is an extremely critical conversation that we also hope that you join us for. I posted the link for the Student Race and Ed panel that's happening on October 22nd in the chat. Thank you again to our amazing panelists. Thank you again to the Hunt team who has volunteered their evening time to help make this conversation happen. And we hope to see you on a Hunt Institute webinar soon. Thank you all again.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
Be blessed.
Take care.